Hello, and welcome to Why Does This Keep Happening to Me? A podcast about how we keep ourselves stuck and how to become unstuck. Today, we're talking about fear. And how fear keeps us stuck in our patterns and doesn't allow us to move forward into goals that we may set for ourselves. And fear is a very primitive emotion. It's believed to be the first emotion we experience in our life. And it's in the very primitive part of our brains. So it's actually very adaptive and very helpful for us. And people that don't have fear indicate that there could be a sign of brain damage. So fear is really helpful and it is vital to our survival. So the problem comes up when it becomes dominant and it doesn't allow us to move forward. It gets us into a feeling of being stuck or frozen. So when we are exposed to something that brings up fear, and fear being an emotional response to something that is deemed to be threatening or dangerous, what happens is our brain activates a part of our brain called the amygdala. And our brain says there's danger, and it sends our body into fight or flight. And like I said, this is really vital to keep us in survival because, as you can imagine, fight or flight is what allowed our ancestors to survive when they were out hunting, for example. They had to be very aware and very much aware of any dangerous situation or predator that could kill the person that is hunting. So we are born with this sort of negativity bias where we are constantly scanning our environment for danger and for anything that could harm us, harm our survival, threaten our survival. So when this cascade of reactions begin, when we are exposed to something that brings up fear and the amygdala activates, we go into fight, flight, or freeze. And so fight is we're getting prepared to be able to fight a predator. Flight is being able to run, and freeze is that image of a deer in headlights where you're just frozen and you see the fear, you see the predator, you see the event or the scenario, but you're kind of frozen. That also has a very adaptive function as well. You can see where in certain animals, when they are threatened, their survival is threatened, what ensures their survival is to freeze. And so that with certain animals, that indicates to the predator that this animal is dead. And many predators will not continue to attack their prey if they believe that their prey is dead. So this freeze response can sometimes lead to survival as well, where it gets the predator to back off. So all of these reactions are adaptive. The problem is that they are only meant to be present in threatening situations and for short periods of time. And so when we are in this fight or flight response and we have this cascade of cortisol that goes through our body, our blood pressure rises, our mouth gets dry, and our extremity, we get clammy because all the blood rushes out of our extremities into the center of our body to ensure that if we were to be cut, we wouldn't bleed to death. And our activity in our lungs and heart go up so that we can run and fight and flee. So this is, as I said, it's supposed to only last a short period of time. But when we're in a stress response and that we believe that we're in danger, we stay in this response for much longer than our body can handle. And this is what people describe as burnout. And when people say we have to decrease our stress because it decreases our longevity if we're in a stressful situation. So what happens is we have to become cognizant of when we are in this fight or flight response and interrupt it. And there are different ways to interrupt it. But today we're going to talk about how we get stuck because of fear and how fear impairs our ability to move forward in our life and what we can do about it. So I've invited a guest today, my partner, Dr. Lauren Fisher, and we're going to talk about our experience of fear, not only in our lives, but also how we observe this coming up in our clients' lives, in our psychotherapy hours with other people that share their personal stories about how they feel that they're stuck and how, more importantly, they become unstuck.
Okay, so I want to welcome Dr. Lauren Fisher, who is actually my partner at Delray Psych and Wellness, and we have been working together for over 10 years, and we took this leap of faith and we joined our practices, and our practice has grown in the last several years, and so I thought she'd be a great person to have come into the podcast and talk about fears. So welcome, Dr. Fisher.
Thank you, Dr. B, for having me. I'm very excited to be on your podcast, which I know has been a dream of yours for a long time. So it is really awesome to see it coming into fruition now. And
Thank you. Thanks for coming on and being my first guest. So today we're talking about facing your fears and how that comes up in our lives, and how we see that in our clients' lives, in our personal lives. And so when I approached Dr. Fisher about coming on the podcast, and I gave her an option of what topics she wanted to talk about that would be helpful for all of you, she chose Face Your Fears. So I'm just curious, just to start off, what was it about this topic that prompted you to come on to the podcast? What is it about fear that was prevalent in your life to talk about?
well, I think it's so much personal experience between myself, between us and our journey, and pretty much every human being. Like, it's something that is known to all of us. But I think over time, I think the biggest takeaway is to realize how liberating facing your fears can be, and overcoming them or moving through them. And I just want to share that with everybody, because I feel, and you tell me, but I feel like a lot of us keep ourselves kind of really stuck or in a very small prison because of our limiting beliefs and fears, and we're missing out, whether that's experiencing life or maybe reaching our full potential. So it's just definitely a topic I have endless thoughts on and love talking about.
Yeah, and I think that what's interesting about fear is that it's actually really healthy and adaptive to experience fear, because if we didn't have any fear, we wouldn't survive. So it's always figuring out where that fine balance is between experiencing fear and letting it push you, rather than letting it keep you in a freeze mode where you're not. People fall into an avoidant pattern. I think we see this a lot in our lives, but in our clients and our friends and families and ourselves, that sometimes we want to do something, but we get into this freeze mode where there's this avoidance and this feeling of being stuck. And I think that was what inspired me too to talk about this today, is where that fine line is between allowing fear to protect you rather than keep you in a stuck mode.
Yeah, well, you're right. It's sort of, when you understand it, then you can leverage it, right?
Right, and you can use it.
Yeah, you demystify it. Suddenly it's not so scary when you understand what it is and how to come through it, right?
Right. Yeah. So there was this movie I had brought up to you that I had seen a few years ago called Beasts of the Southern Wild, and there's a little girl, and she's really scared of these beasts. It's a great movie. It was an independent movie, and she's always running from them. She's this tiny little girl, and these beasts are 20 times bigger than her. and she's always running through the fields away from them. And there's a part of the movie where she just stops and turns around and walks up to this beast that's like giant thing hovering over her, and she just stares it in the face, and it just kind of grunts and walks away. And so that's I think that was just like such a great visual for me in seeing that you just turn around and face it, and half the time it just kind of goes away, or just, it's not as scary as we think it is sometimes.
Yeah, and you're right, because that's a great example, and I'm sure some people are thinking, well, that sounds easy to do, but it's not. Well, it's not necessarily it's easy, but you're not that part of your brain that's that fear center that you talked about, that fight or flight or fright, every time you feed it, it gets stronger. So when you stop feeding it, you give it a chance to do something different, right? This girl faced her beast, and she learned it wasn't as scary, right? And that part of the brain calmed down. So that's
totally.
Such a visual, totally.
Yeah. So how do you see people, you can bring in about experiences with a client or yourself, feeding it rather than demystifying it, not letting it be so big and controlling?
Yeah. It's funny. I was reading something the other day, and they were likening, to answer your question, is feeding it, I think, comes through avoidance, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were telling a story about this cute little tiger that came to the door, and you're like, oh, it's so cute, and I'm going to feed it. And then it grows a little bigger, and all of a sudden you've got to now it's not just table scraps, right? You've got to get bigger. And then it grows bigger, and now you've got hunks of meat, and then suddenly the animal just is so ferocious. And they kind of liken that to every time that feeding was the avoidance until that anxiety gets so big, it just controls you, right? And so I think that people, consciously, unconsciously, they avoid facing their fears, right? And it's a kind of a trick of the mind to be oh, this is safe, this will protect you from getting hurt, right? Rejected, failure, feeling bad, whatever it may be. And it works temporarily, but it doesn't work for the long run, right? And
right.
So
That's true.
And I think people get stuck in these things oh, I could never do that. I could whatever. So sometimes I think people are so used to their fears or anxieties or accepting that that's the truth that they don't even examine them.
Yeah, that's so true. I think that example you gave comes up so much in therapy, where people say they have to confront someone, a parent or a spouse or a friend, and they say, well, I don't want to confront them because that's scary and uncomfortable, so I'd rather just avoid discomfort. But then the realization comes where the discomfort actually is not avoided. It just continues and manifests for years rather than just confronting it for that 5 minutes, and then it's most likely either gone or very much decreased.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, let's elaborate on the example you gave, because I think this is a big one. People are terrified to communicate with others, right? And sometimes there are reasons, right? But that example is something I hear a lot. Well, I'm not going to talk to her. They won't let me. They'll never hear me. They won't understand me, right? And that's just sort of boom, then there's no reason, right, to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but when you and I think we do this a lot in therapy, and we encourage people, if you actually just stop and just write out the fear, or just be what am I really afraid of, then you can really start to identify what exactly what do I feel, how bad is that fear, what it is. And then you said when you bring that awareness to it, then you can start to think about how do I move through it, or maybe what might happen if it actually went well, right?
Right. Yeah. And so what am I really afraid of? That's a really great point when you ask people that and you really break it down. And it's so funny because for me, when I do that, it always ends up to a person saying I'll be homeless. and then they realize how like pretty silly that is, because it'll be like, okay, well, why won't you tell your teacher how you feel, or your boss? Well, if I tell my boss how I feel, then I might lose my job. And then what would happen? Well, then I couldn't pay my bills. And then what would happen? Well, then I'd be homeless. You know, like it just keeps going into homelessness, or I would die, you know. And then, you know, really when you break it down like that and you say, oh, so you telling your boss that you felt disrespected or not heard in this meeting is going to somehow end up with you either dying or being homeless. And then it sounds so silly, right?
Sure. And that's like how wild our mind can be, right? Like it can be so great at like developing stories that aren't true, because like all we know is what we know right now, right? So the anxious mind's always dictating. But like you said, what if you're like, hey, what if you talk to your boss and he heard you and he listened to you and he actually acknowledged or made changes? Imagine like what that would feel like, right? And that induces sort of like this, oh, well, that could feel good, right? And like it starts to give them this like possibility that like actually it's possible that something might be beneficial, right?
Yeah, and that the opposite of fear is freedom, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I was when I was reading up about fear, doing research about fear, and it was saying one thing that I came across that was so interesting was that humans are the most fearful creatures on the planet. That is only because of our ability to learn, think, and create fear. And so it's not necessarily that we are in more danger. It's just because we are learning, thinking, and creating fear in our heads all the time.
Totally. You know? And that leads me to the statement I saw, and it says you create fear, and you have the power to create fear, and you have the power to dissolve it as well. Right.
Yeah.
Like that's your point. Like, and I think it's important. Like I think you hit on this earlier. Like fear is a healthy thing. Like our bodies to respond to like true fear, right? Like pain or danger, right? Like that was meant to keep us alive, and those are still like really healthy. But the fear, you know, I think you and I are talking about for the most part is sort of right, like what we've learned from a painful experience, and it, or what's been taught to us, right? Like fear those people or that situation, like things that your family or other people have like put on you, you've just adopted, right? And so like those fears that are learned, I think more often than not are the ones that what people spend their time on, and are the ones that are most interfere most with their life.
Yeah, that's a great point, because so the three types of fear, basically the categories are the instinctive fear, which is pain, you know, has to do with pain and survival. Learned fear, which is what you're talking about. These are our associations, our experiences of people, places, and situations. And taught fear, which is basically the definition of racism. So it's just what we've been taught to fear other people, other groups, other cultures. So when we realize that the only one we're really born with is instinctive fear, the other two are learned fears.
Right. And, you know, people say to me all the time, well, hey, listen, I mean, let's say I'm afraid of dogs biting me. They're like, a dog did bite me. Like, I didn't imagine that happened. And you're like, absolutely, right? But then, you know, so we can't say, hey, that's not a true fear. But what happens is often like is when there's been an experience, right? People then overestimate like the danger of that happening, right? All of the time in so many different ways. So there's so many like thought errors, and they underestimate like their ability to weather the outcome, even if it's uncomfortable or painful or whatever, you know. So it gets so much place in that fear and avoidance versus like, you know, preparing and believing and seeing in themselves like what they're actually able to withstand, even though most of the time the outcomes aren't negative. They tend to be positive, you know, when people push themselves through the fear.
Yeah. And so then what you're talking about is this reality of a person, for example, that was bitten by a dog. And so most people would just, you know, that was a difficult situation. I was afraid in the moment, and then they talk about it, they process it, and then it kind of like they recover from it. But some people end up with a phobia, right, where they're afraid of dogs, and they're like, well, that's because I was bitten by a dog. But I think that what we've learned as psychotherapists is that the difference, I think, between the ones that end up with that fear just overwhelming them and not recovering from it are the ones where that experience what triggered a past trauma that was not resolved and triggered a belief that was not resolved. And so maybe like a belief about being powerless or helpless in their life. So maybe the person that has experienced many life experiences with being powerless and helpless, that experience of being bitten by a dog could possibly bring up a phobia, whereas another person that has not ever had an experience or had, many life experiences of being helpless or powerless may not have these like phobic experiences related to this dog, right?
Right.
So that's interesting. It's like we look at it in terms of beliefs, and when people ask, well, how come one person experienced the same thing from their neighbor, but then one person wasn't able to recover from it and another person was? Like, what separates people from developing anxieties rather than just recovering and moving along from it and not being stuck?
Yeah, they continue to put themselves in the same situation, right? Versus avoiding it. Yeah, like really, really, really good points. And I think that the behavior and the thoughts, like how powerful they are, right? But we forget, we can be in charge of our thoughts, right? And what we believe.
Yeah. And being aware of what those beliefs are, I think that's another thing you were talking about earlier when you said people think, oh, this is the way that it is. It's not going to work out, even if I try. Well, that is a belief. That's a belief of being disempowered and being hopeless and helpless. So then how have you seen those moments where people break out of that?
Yeah, well, so, number one, like we were talking about, I think it's the willingness. And I'll give you an example of with a client recent, which it's nice when it works textbook, they want to examine. This was one, there was a fear of communication, right, with in-laws. And they were afraid because based on the way the in-laws they were afraid they'd be rejected, mocked in the family. There was definitely risk to communicating these years of feelings that this client had. But what we did in the process was first really get to the underlying, right, what the fears were. And that brought up a lot of physiological anxiety in this client. And so, even I think first what we had to also do is use some breathing and relaxation techniques to just even ease that anxiety a little bit, because it was so terrifying to even think about going ahead to do the positive communication and imagine the positive results. So, we were able to do some relaxation, then have her visualize how it was going to go, have her be in touch with her power of what she was in control of and what her intention was, right? So regardless of outcome, communicating her feelings, being able to try to be the healthiest person in the dynamic, even though the others may not be healthy, that was really empowering to the client. And so we just practiced mentally and started to set up that scenario for her to be successful. And when you do that in your mind, visualizing, you start setting up that neural pathway also. So she did go into the conversation, and yes, she was very anxious about it. It's not about not having fear. You just have to be a little bit stronger than your fear in any situation. I think that's an important point to come back to. And she did it, and she communicated, and it actually went really, really well. And it's after 10 years of not having a relationship, she created the opportunity for a reconnection and a relationship to work. And she feels a world of relief, because she also not only for the family, but had lost her voice along the way. And so one thing I had said to her too, and I say to everybody, is that even if the outcome doesn't work, there's going to be strength in building your confidence, right? Just by facing a fear and attempting to go through it, right? So
yeah. So now you build that feeling of empowerment. You've practiced it, and even if it hasn't gone perfectly well, your brain understands that you have survived it and you've come out on the other side, and that you have a voice and you can express that voice. So many things come from that, even if it didn't work out perfectly. It's like so empowering.
Well,
right?
And if I can, I got a funny story that relates with you and I. If I
Oh God, we have so many stories.
I mean, we've been along each other's journey for a while, and there's been different fears, right? But what's funny on Facebook, you gotta love Facebook memories, right? Because they bring up things. And the thing that popped up, it was 5 years ago, 2015, you and I were launching our big program of like, what was it called? It was like free.
I think it was called Face Your Fears, maybe.
More or less. It was like overcome, like be you, be the best you but the whole thing, right, was about what we're talking about now. And so Dr. B and I had gone to Mega Institute, and we participated in this workshop that was just really life-changing. It was really about tuning into your intuition and also learning how like your anxious mind or your thinking mind can be helpful but unhelpful. And, I think in that particular weekend, it really helped me to realize like how much of my own fears of failure, rejection, looking stupid, all that good stuff, that I had carried with me for so long, but were maybe more covert. And it just made me realize that like it had definitely been stopping me from going to the next level of like doing a workshop or putting ourselves out there, or I mean, at that time we didn't know we were going to launch a wellness center, but things of that nature, things that would put us more in the public eye and that people would be watching, right? So I remember this workshop, we were like, we're going to do it. And that was definitely consciously thinking like, this is scary, but you know what, we're going to do it. And we were so excited. We spent hours creating it, right?
Yeah. Oh my God, I know. And the one thing I remember, one of the moments I remember that we broke out of that fear, well, there were several, but when we were at the workshop, it was Sonia Choquette's workshop. She's amazing. And she had us all, number one, not sit next to people we would sit next to day after day. So we'd have to keep trying something new, like not being attached to that place in the room. And then she had us dance. You remember that? She had us just get in the back of the room with like 50 other strangers, and she turned the music on, and she just wanted us to dance. And it was so uncomfortable, but yet so liberating.
Okay, I'm going to call you on this. Like, it's uncomfortable, but you were like a teenager. Like, you have rhythm. I have zero. I am a white girl with no rhythm whatsoever. So, unconscious your discomfort, but we all know mine was like a 9 out of a 10. And I was like trying to shake the arms, and I'm like, maybe I can just get around with a shoulder roll. And it was like, I gotta dance. And I forgot that. It's a great example of, right? Like, get past discomfort, right?
And that's a great example because look, you don't have to go down to the back and dance like a diva, but if you just start shaking your shoulders, then the next thing you know, you'll be shaking your hips, and the next thing you know, you'll be dancing like a diva.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happened.
And then, like, and I guess it's like what we were saying before about, like, exposing yourself to it, right? And once you're, like, in it, like, then we're all, like, laughing, connecting, right? And it wasn't, like, the fears went out the window because it really didn't matter, But if we had given in, or if I had given in to that fear and we didn't have that kind of instructor, I wouldn't have connected with people that way. And I think that's, like, the other thing is, like, again, what are we missing? Like, what are we not experiencing by, like, keeping ourselves, like, in these, like, cages, right? Anyway.
Right.
So
what are we missing out on?
Right. So let me go back to our workshop, right? So we got this great workshop, which, by the way, is an off workshop. It was not the time to launch it, though, even though we felt like it, right? And we were ready, and we thought hundreds would come. We rented this, like, yoga room. We thought we'd be famous. That wasn't, like, our intention, and then, like, what happened?
One person came, and we connected to her, in a very authentic way, but only one person came. And I remember that day where we were waiting for them to come, and I looked at you and I said, what if everybody comes? And then that was like so scary. And then I was like, what if nobody comes? Like either one was bad. You know?
Oh,
yeah.
And, you know, like, I remember after, because we really poured our hearts into it, and I truly believe now that that was just, it was a matter of when it was launching. Like, we literally knew nobody nor knew how to market, and it just wasn't our time, you know, but it was really disappointing. And, you know, I can't speak for your experience, but like mine, like it did feel like this failure. And I think you could say it was a failure in the fact that like our outcome wasn't what we hoped it to be, but like also realizing that like good came from that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and that was like, I think immediate, and then like stuff that wasn't immediate. And for me, immediate, I was just like, well, I'm proud I like put all this time in with you because we saw like this wonderful stuff we could create together and we were ready to do. And that just like moved me like further along with like confidence, you know? At the time, yeah. So I don't know what your experience was, but it was.
No, I mean, that's true. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'll let you speak.
No, that's so true because the you know, I was looking up also the universal fears that all adults feel no matter where you are in the world, and the two are humiliation and failure. So in that moment, it was like what you said, like, oh my God, we failed. But I think that what we have an ability to do well that helps us get out of that stuck thing we've been talking about and moving forward and growing that we can pass along to you listening is that I think the perspective of it changed for us. So what you just described is not the perspective of, oh my God, we failed, we're never going to do this again. It was like, wow, we tried it, we did it. That was so, you know, like we're going to learn from it. Now we know what we're capable of. Like it was just change the perspective instead of making it a negative.
Yeah. And, you know, this, and I'm just going to just tell a little story off of that, which goes to one of the, like, maybe bigger fears I had to face. And, you know, you and I always talk about, like, there are just unpleasant things in life, and, like, you're not really sure what sense that makes in your journey, if at all, until, like, you've been down the road a little bit. And I think that, like, one of this, you know, aside from what we're mentioning, like, we had spent a lot of time, and I remember you saying, like, I don't know if this is, like, worth my time. Like, I don't know if it's worth this time and energy to, like, keep putting into this. And at that time, if it's okay for me sharing, like, in your life,
yeah,
like,
sure,
your family, like, your children, you know, they, you know, it makes sense, right? Like, you know, they were the main focus of your attention. And at that point, I remember you saying, you know what, I'm kind of debating if you wanted to go into like third child, and then third child, right? Like became a priority for you and happened. And it was interesting because like that, like failure and then you, but like then you kind of doing your own thing, like made me have to face the fear, which my fear was always like just doing things by myself. Like ever since we left the toxic practice back in the day, like even when I moved and started my own business, like I made sure I was around people, you know, like every move I was like, I wanted somebody with me and doing it. And, you know, and I appreciated being able to like do this program with you, but it also made me realize, because I never knew if you were coming back, to be honest, right? Because you're a great mother and you have children. And I'm like, well, you know, maybe she won't, maybe she'll come back, you know, and do work later. So it made me like at that time, even though it was just like little putting myself out there, but like starting to run some little workshops myself or like getting out in the community more. And so it made me like face the fear of like doing things by myself, as well as, you know, again, putting yourself out there just to build confidence and not worry about what other people were thinking. And the greatest part about all that is that we ended up back together on the same journey, which is nice, you know. But, you know, even uncomfortable experiences, right? Like, I mean, we learn from, or, well, if you have a growth mindset, right, then you take that with you. So,
yeah, then you learn, and then you just take it all as each of those experiences as a positive, moving you towards your destiny and your journey. And also not only like doing it with intention, we always talk about intention. That's like a whole other podcast that I'm going to be doing, but also not being completely attached to anything, to outcome, not being attached to like what this is supposed to look like. Because sometimes it looks totally different and it's even better than you thought.
yeah.
So we're going to wrap up. We're going to probably continue this talk on another podcast. I think this could be several sessions that we talk about. There's so many stories regarding facing your fears, both professionally and personally. I think that we could do one on that as well. But feel free to email us any of your questions at delraypsych.com. You can check us out there and on our Facebook page and Instagram. And I just want to thank Dr. Fisher for coming on our show.
Hi, for having me. And would it be okay for me to leave people with 2 quotes?
Of course. Go ahead.
Well, I love this one quote from Mark Twain, which said that I have suffered so many misfortunes in my life, many of which never have occurred. So
I love that.
tell you that to remind you of, to help.
Yeah, that is so true.
Suffer necessarily, that things can be done. And my other favorite one is on the other side of fear is freedom. So every time you push yourself through a fear, through that discomfort, like just stop and like feel like that feeling of what it feels like. It's always liberating. Always. And that is just, again, it builds your confidence. And I just want you to remember those 2 things. And if nothing else, everything we've talked about is that everything is changeable and can be changed, even if you don't think it can be.
So true and so inspiring. Thank you so much for coming on. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Looking forward to all of your installment of podcasts.
Thank you for listening, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Enchanté.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fisher, for taking the time to meet with us today. That was really inspiring. Just great to hear about different people's stories regarding fear and how fear can either help you grow or it can be an obstacle to where you are meant to be. You can find other episodes of Why Does This Keep Happening to Me on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. You can learn more about Delray Psych and Wellness by visiting our website at delraypsych.com. To learn more about how to schedule a session or how to email me, please go to our website. Until next time, this is Dr. B.